Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at all of the evidence for natural selection. So all the different people that were involved in this, all the different evidence that they came up with and how it all links together.
Evidence for natural selection. Charles Darwin used his observations that he collected when he went on his travels, especially around the Galapagos Islands, in order to make his conclusions about natural selection happening, causing evolution. First of all, his observations showed that offspring look similar to their parents, which suggested there was some inherited characteristics going on. He also noted, though, that no two individuals are identical. This is obviously evidence of variation. He noted that organisms produce a large number of offspring, but the population, or the relative population size, stayed roughly stable. So there isn't a massive increase all the time, every time we produce lots of offspring. These observations allowed him to draw these conclusions. Lots of offspring are produced, but the population size stays stable because there's a struggle to survive and not all organisms manage to actually survive. Some individuals, due to variation, have characteristics that allow them to survive because they are better adapted to the environment and they pass on these characteristics. These conclusions helped form the idea of evolution by natural selection because eventually, over time, this passing on of characteristics will change a population's features or an individual's features. We mustn't forget that Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with this theory independently due to his travels as well, and they published their findings together. Darwin is more widely recognized because once he wrote all of these theories down in his book on the origin of species, which they were more widely accepted by the public and the scientific community. We have lots of sources of evidence for evolution by natural selection. Fossils, for example, when we arrange fossils in chronological order, they show gradual changes in features over time. Not something available to Darwin, but now we can have DNA sequences that also show gradual changes in base sequences over time due to mutation. More changes in these base sequences means that organisms are less related to each other. Proteins and other molecules, including antibodies, can be compared, and they can also show changes in amino acid sequences. Again, the more similar these amino acid sequences, the more related organisms are, so they can show evolutionary relationships. Other examples that we also have are things like evolution of resistance to pesticides in plants and evolution of resistance of antibiotics in bacteria. Evidence for evolution. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, that all living things evolved from simple life forms from over 3 billion years ago, was initially rejected because of some different reasons. Most people at the time still believed that humans have been on Earth since the beginning because they were created by God. This made them very against coming to terms with the idea that humans had evolved from other organisms over time. There was not enough fossil evidence at the time to support this idea of change from simple organisms to more complex ones over time, because they just hadn't all been found. The mechanism of inheritance, so genes that get passed on from parent to offspring, was not known at the time either. So you can see we've got a tree of life here to kind of give you the idea of what we're talking about. So this idea that there was a common ancestor a long time ago, and sequentially over time, all of these different species have evolved, and they can all be traced back to that common ancestor. Fossils are the remains or impressions of dead organisms from millions of years ago found in rocks. They're formed when the organism dies, and often parts fall into mud or sediment, so for example at the bottom of the ocean. The remains are then buried under layers of more sediment. Over time, the soft parts of the organisms decay, but the hard parts like bones and shells are replaced by minerals over millions of years. This process is known as mineralization. So there's some examples of different type of rock-based fossils. So there's the bones of a skeleton of a dinosaur there, and obviously the bones are the hard parts that didn't decay, and over time they've been replaced by minerals. So they're not actually bones anymore, they're just a different type of rock. There's a cast of the inside of a shell, so a shell has imprinted or pushed into the sediment, or the minerals have built up inside the shell, and then the shell has been disappeared or broken down, and we've got that imprint left. And then even a leaf. So that obviously is not hard parts of an organism because it's a leaf, it's soft tissue, but it's been pressed into the rock, and that imprint has then been replaced by minerals. And so we get that different coloured imprint in that rock face. In another type of unique condition, organisms can get fully trapped in ice or amber. So amber is tree sap, so the sticky stuff that comes out of trees, tree sap that came out of trees but then instantly solidified and hardened, and then that traps the organism inside the sap. Or if they were frozen in ice for a really long time, this means that no oxygen can get in, so there's no decay. So the soft tissues and the hard tissues are all preserved inside the fossil. The conditions need to be unique, and it only really happens in the ice or in this amber material because there's no oxygen, there'll be no bacteria, and the temperatures are normally quite low or stable. And so all of those conditions need to be there for there to be no decay of the soft parts of the organism. But these are also fossils, even though they're not in rocks. Fossils are one of the most significant sources of evidence for evolution. This is because they can be dated and they can be put in order to show detail about extinct organisms, so organisms that are no longer alive or no longer exist, and they can show how organisms have changed over time. Fossils are a unique piece of evidence for natural selection, and they've been able to show this evidence for quite a long time. And obviously, as we collect more fossils, the evidence grows and gets stronger. Because what we were able to do was, once we were able to date them and put them in sequence order, it shows that there were species that lived a long time ago that are now extinct, and that they were very different from some species today. It showed that when those old species died out, they were replaced by new species. And these new species were often very similar to those older species, and they tend to be found in the same place. So you can see here I've got my layers of rocks, and you can see that obviously potentially if they were found in a similar place, similar geographic location, and potentially in the same layer of rock, that suggests kind of a close age between them. They were kind of deposited at the same time. So what we can do is we can sequence these fossils in order over time, and it shows you that there were older species, they died out, they were replaced by new species that were quite similar. And we get this sequence of slow changes over time that show that one species probably arose from another species. An example is the evolution of horses, which we can track through fossils of their leg bones, leg and feet bones. So these leg feet bones have been placed in order to show the gradual change over time of various ancestors of our modern day horses. And that shows the change in the toes as well as the length and size of their legs. The reason their feet changed is they had to survive walking on different ground as their habitat changed from quite wet grasslands to quite dry, dusty areas. This was all due to climate change, but if you're living in mud where your feet could sink in, having lots of toes and spreading that surface area of your foot out is better to be able to survive walking around and not getting stuck in the mud. Also, they were a smaller organism then, but as the climate changed and they had to adapt to all these new changes, they then more likely to survive if you had fewer toes, because you were able to run faster on the harder ground. And so therefore you're more able to outrun predators, which means you're more likely to survive and therefore reproduce. So over time, the selection pressure, or the natural selection pressure, the advantage was to have smaller number of toes or fewer number of toes and have longer legs. All of that meant that they were faster and more able to outrun predators as the harder ground changed as well. So over time, obviously, each of these different horse species would have been surpassed by the next one. So the Hydrocotherium, the very early one, would have gone extinct as the ground started to change, but the Mesohippus, which would have been formed by random mutation to have fewer toes, only 3 instead of 4, and so then that one would have been more likely to survive. And then again, there would have been a mutation in that population, which would have led to maybe only 1 larger middle toe, 2 smaller back toes. Then that would have meant the Merychippus would have then been more able to survive in that environment, more able to outrun predators, therefore more likely to survive and reproduce. So then that would have passed on that difference in the foot shape, and again, and so on over millions of years and multiple generations.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.